Osileia, posso começar então, Osileia? Olá, Osileia, quer começar então introduzindo então os primeiros palestrantes e depois o Jerry continua, pode ser? Está em silêncio. Osileia, você está em silêncio. Pode ligar o microfone?
Oh, pois não. Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. Sejam todos bem-vindos à primeira edição do Dia dos Oceanos, na década do oceano, e nós, o E-Center Portugal e o Labomar, a Universidade Federal do Ceará, em conjunto realizamos esse evento para você, né? Com muito carinho, nesse evento internacional, né? De grande caráter técnico e direcionado a todos os estudantes, pesquisadores, professores, gestores, o setor produtivo e a sociedade em geral. Neste ano de 2021, teremos como tema central a tecnologia para a observação do oceano, objetivando disseminar o conhecimento científico e tecnológico de inovação e de inteligência artificial. Entendemos que este tema tem aderência ao objetivo 6 da década do oceano, um oceano transparente, acessível aos dados coletados, mas tem também aplicação nos outros objetivos traçados pela Unesco para a década dos oceanos, como um oceano limpo, um oceano saudável, um oceano resiliente, um oceano previsível, um oceano seguro, um oceano produtivo e explorado de modo sustentável, e um oceano transparente, que é esse que iremos tratar mais nesse foco hoje, que seria acessível aos dados, e um oceano conhecido e valorizado. Considerando a interdisciplinaridade do tema, contamos com a colaboração de profissionais diversos, com suas experiências de sucesso. Grandes serão as contribuições de hoje, como resultado deste grande encontro entre Estados Unidos, Portugal, África do Sul e Brasil. Somos um único oceano. Esperamos aqui contactar pessoas de diversos países para que possamos trocar experiências, aprender uns com os outros e, consequentemente, expandir essa rede de saberes, de experiências, de ações ligadas ao oceano, disseminando-as na sociedade e criando, assim, uma rede colaborativa de saberes do oceano. Então, contamos aqui hoje com um time de como pesquisadores, né, que eu gostaria que o Moutinho, que juntos organizamos esse evento, apresente.
Okay, so, actually, we will start with our director of the university, com o reitor da universidade, não é, Osileia? Podemos apresentar os primeiros palestrantes, então? Só um minuto aqui, que eu vou desligar. Pronto, eu estava testando a tradução. Então, nós temos hoje um grupo muito diverso de pessoas que vão discutir o tema da tecnologia dos oceanos. Basicamente, nós vamos ter 4 pessoas que vão dar as boas-vindas a todos nesse evento. Primeiramente, o José Cândido Lustosa Bittencourt de Albuquerque, que é o reitor da Universidade Federal do Ceará. A Karen Silverwood-Kopp, que é do Comitê Nacional para a Década dos Oceanos. O comandante Ricardo Barrilho Cruz, da Capitania dos Portos do Ceará, e também o secretário do Ambiente do Estado do Ceará, Arthur Bruno. Logo depois, vamos ter uma breve introdução do Jerry Miller, presidente e fundador da Science for Decisions dos Estados Unidos. O Jerry, vai introduzir depois os seguintes, como se diz, palestrantes e debatedores, começando pelo Alan Leonard, que é o atual presidente e CEO do consórcio para a liderança dos oceanos nos Estados Unidos. Depois vamos ter uma discussão que eu espero muito animada e muito interessante com o João Tasso, com a Mary Sakamoto e a Sandy Tomala. Depois vamos ter uma sessão de perguntas e respostas com o público, depois uma ronda final de comentários, e depois voltamos novamente ao Zilé e eu para fechar o evento. Então, eu gostaria de chamar, então, agora o reitor da Universidade Federal do Ceará para dar boas-vindas a todos.
Muito obrigado. Eu gostaria de cumprimentar José Luiz Moutinho e a professora Osileia pela realização dessa primeira edição do Dia dos Oceanos, na década dos oceanos. Cumprimento também Karen Coop, coordenadora geral de Oceanos, Antártica e Geociência do Ministério da Ciência, Tecnologia e Inovação. Com muito prazer, cumprimento o capitão de mar e guerra, Ricardo Barilo, comandante da Capitania dos Portos do Ceará, e o nosso amigo Arthur Bruno, secretário de Meio Ambiente do Estado do Ceará. E aproveito para dar as boas-vindas a todos que participam deste momento, registrando a felicidade da Universidade Federal do Ceará de participar de um evento com essa dimensão. Que bom que estamos cuidando dos nossos oceanos. Que bom que estamos utilizando as tecnologias, desenvolvendo novos conhecimentos para proteger os nossos oceanos. E isso é fundamental. Nós precisamos manter planeta saudável para as próximas gerações. Esse é o nosso dever, essa é a nossa obrigação. E nessa tarefa, certamente, as universidades estão destinado um local muito específico, dada a sua própria expertise. Aqui no Ceará, nós temos o nosso Labomar, Instituto de Ciência do Mar, tão bem dirigido pela nossa professora Osileia, e tenho certeza que daremos uma grande contribuição nesse evento, nessa primeira edição do Dia dos Oceanos, se tratando da década dos oceanos. É claro que estamos fazendo isso, a humanidade está fazendo isso de maneira atrasada, mas não está fora da época, está em tempo, ainda é tempo. Mais do que apenas proteger, que já é muito, precisamos conscientizar a humanidade, precisamos conscientizar os governos, as instituições, as corporações, da necessidade de que tenhamos um olhar diferenciado para os nossos oceanos. Aqui no Ceará temos procurado fazer isso. Temos uma boa parceria com a Capitania dos Portos, por exemplo. O Labomar tem feito grandes estudos e eu fico muito feliz, professora Osileia, quando vejo que o mundo está se unindo nessa tarefa de proteger, de bem proteger os nossos oceanos. Isso é um dever nosso. E a universidade, como disse, tem um papel extremamente importante no desenvolvimento dessas ações de proteção dos nossos mares. É tempo de fazer isso. É o momento de fazer isso. É obrigação nossa fazer isso. E a Universidade Federal do Ceará tem essa consciência, sabe dessa necessidade e evitará todos os esforços necessários para que, não só de pessoal, mas de tecnologia, mas, acima de tudo, com o objetivo de conscientizar a humanidade quanto à necessidade de que tratemos com amor, com carinho, os nossos mares, os nossos oceanos. Fico feliz com a possibilidade de participar deste evento que considero importantíssimo, que é decisivo, na verdade, pelo que representa como conscientização das pessoas quanto a essa necessidade. Queria desejar, finalmente, um bom trabalho a cada um dos participantes, que resulte desse encontro conclusões e uma consciência bem mais firme na defesa das nossas águas internacionais, dos nossos oceanos. Portanto, e fica aqui o meu abraço, o nosso agradecimento pela oportunidade da participação da nossa universidade, na certeza de que contribuiremos com esse evento para melhorar a nossa ação de proteção dos nossos mares. Muito obrigado.
Olha, muito obrigado, né? E muito obrigado por essa introdução. E eu agora passo a palavra para Osileia, que daqui para frente vai continuar agora introduzindo os próximos palestrantes. Pode ser, Osileia?
Sim, claro. Sim, claro. Aqui na nossa ordem, né, nós temos aqui na sequência a representante, a doutora Karen, né, que está aqui conosco, seria do Ministério da Ciência e Tecnologia, a coordenadora para assuntos de oceanos no Ministério da Ciência e Tecnologia. Por favor, senhora Karen.
Obrigada, Zileia. É um prazer estar aqui com vocês hoje. Queria saudar todos os participantes aqui do evento e dizer que é uma satisfação para mim estar aqui compartilhando com vocês e discutindo o tema que é o oceano, que é fundamental para toda a agenda da sustentabilidade nessa conjuntura maior que a gente tem. Afinal, é a Semana do Meio Ambiente, né? Dia 5 foi o Dia Mundial do Meio Ambiente, do qual esse ecossistema marinho faz uma participação integral fundamental. A gente tem desenvolvido no Brasil ações dedicadas para movimentar, comunicar e engajar a década da ciência oceânica. Como vocês sabem, é a primeira vez que é declarada uma década em homenagem à ciência. e com isso discutir os desafios, né, que nos trazem de promover e comunicar a ciência sobre o oceano a serviço da sustentabilidade, né? A gente precisa reverter os processos de exploração e uso do oceano que são degradantes, né? E com a melhor evidência científica e do conhecimento tradicional disponível, fortalecer aqueles sistemas e essas tecnologias, né? Tecnologia não está só na academia, também está nas populações e comunidades tradicionais, né? Sobre como promover o uso e a exploração sustentável do oceano, né? E é nesse sentido que a gente promoveu no Brasil a estruturação e a preparação do Brasil da década com um comitê de assessoramento, que contém 16 representantes de várias áreas da sociedade. Então, temos representantes da área de comunicação, jornalismo, especialistas da área de oceano, representantes de comunidades de pesca artesanal, comunidades relacionadas a atividades, né, marinhas, e assim a gente vem discutindo como melhor preparar o Brasil. Ao longo desse processo, em 2020, as regiões do Brasil se organizaram voluntariamente em grupos de apoio à mobilização à década, e foi um processo incrível, espontâneo, que emergiu, né, durante a discussão sobre a década no ano passado, e hoje a gente tem aí organizados 5 grupos de apoio à mobilização regional, que trazem com essa perspectiva regional, local, todo o debate sobre os resultados para a década, os desafios, né, e essa visão das tecnologias tradicionais, das tecnologias científicas que a gente precisa desenvolver para alcançar esses grandes desafios que temos até 2030. Quem quiser conhecer um pouco mais, por favor, entra no site da Década da Ciência Oceânica do Brasil, que é ciencianomar.gov.mcti.gov.br. Lá você tem mais informação sobre esses grupos e como você pode aderir também, né? E esse é um processo que tem permitido que a gente esteja em constante diálogo com milhares e milhares de pessoas em várias iniciativas. E o Brasil tem tido um portfólio extremamente rico e diverso de ações, né, e de debates sobre a ciência que precisamos para o oceano que queremos. Então, é muito importante do lado do MCTI, a gente está ciente dessa grande responsabilidade que a década também né, ajuda a destacar. Para esse ano, a gente vai finalmente fazer a qualificação de uma organização social para pesquisa oceânica, né? Um instituto que vem há muito sendo demandado no âmbito da comunidade científica e que a gente espera que ajude a fortalecer e a consolidar a excelência da pesquisa nacional, né? Investimos também em alguns editais importantes, principalmente o problema mais crônico e agudo que a gente tem, que ameaça a saúde do nosso oceano, que foi o derramamento do óleo no mar no Nordeste, principalmente no Nordeste, mas, na verdade, né, impactou toda a costa do Brasil, e a gente ainda está numa fase crítica e aguda de impactos sobre saúde, ecossistemas e todas as dimensões que isso trouxe, né? E temos uma agenda aí de desenvolvimento e pesquisa embarcada, manutenção dos meios e infraestrutura. Vocês sabem que a compra do navio Vital de Oliveira foi um grande passo no sentido de permitir elevar a capacidade da pesquisa oceanográfica, né, da pesquisa embarcada. É um navio que tem aí uma boa diversidade de equipamentos, instrumentos. E o MCTI também apoia e financia projetos que compõem o nosso sistema de observação e monitoramento do Oceano GUS Brasil, que faz parte, né, de uma rede global em que todos os países monitoram e observam as variáveis oceânicas essenciais, né? O projeto Pirata, que está há mais de 20 anos com observação ininterrupta sobre variáveis oceânicas fundamentais, traz um aporte, um histórico de dados que é fundamental, por exemplo, para a pesquisa, né? E que precisa de uma manutenção anual e constante e de um envolvimento de toda a comunidade acadêmica. Mas a gente sabe que o desenvolvimento das tecnologias para observação e monitoramento marinho precisam de investimentos de alto valor, né? E também de um envolvimento de toda a rede de pesquisa nacional. E o Brasil se orgulha muito de ter, né, os grandes centros de excelência de pesquisa. Temos o Labomar aqui hoje, né, que é um ícone que representa. Temos os Institutos Nacionais de Ciência e Tecnologia, Temos pelo menos 7 INCTs, que são esses institutos, né, que se dedicam a estudos de ciências do mar, e temos os projetos ecológicos de longa duração. Afinal, não há observação e conhecimento suficientes em longas séries históricas, né, que nos permitam informar sobre esse grande ecossistema marinho e sua variação ao longo do tempo. E, é claro, tem um componente fundamental da pesquisa oceânica, que é a pesquisa sobre a Antártica, né? Embora a gente acabe separando um pouco essa área do conhecimento da criosfera, ela nos traz os elementos fundamentais sobre essa perspectiva da mudança do clima e dos elementos da interação oceano-atmosfera, que a gente tanto precisa conhecer e se preparar, pois com o advento da mudança do clima, a resiliência e o entendimento desses processos é fundamental, né? Então, eu queria convidar todos, né, para acompanhar os eventos que a gente tem hoje do Dia dos Oceanos, as iniciativas que são tocadas aqui no Labomar, no E-Center, e tantos projetos interessantes que estão acontecendo em parceria também com outros países, né? O All Atlantic Research Alliance, o ANCO é um deles, do qual o Brasil recém esteve aí em Portugal, nosso secretário Marcelo esteve aí em Portugal para o evento, que também foi um grande sucesso e mostrou a importância da pesquisa sobre o Atlântico Sul, né? E da união dos países que estão juntos estudando o Atlântico Sul e Atlântico Norte, né? O All Atlantic, de polo a polo, né? Então, queria deixar meus agradecimentos por estar aqui com vocês hoje, parabenizar pela realização do evento e desejar a todos um dia do oceano de celebração e também de alerta para que todos se sintam, né, imbuídos dessa responsabilidade de promover um oceano sustentável. Muito obrigada.
Obrigada, Karen, por sua participação, por estar aqui representando o Ministério e a coordenação dos oceanos. Muito obrigada por sua participação. Eu agora convido o capitão de mar e guerra, Ricardo Barilo Cruz, capitão dos portos do estado do Ceará, da Marinha do Brasil.
Bom dia, professora Zileia. Bom dia, boa tarde a todos, né, já que o evento é internacional. Eu gostaria também de saudar a todos, né, em nome da Capitania dos Portos do Ceará e em nome da Marinha do Brasil, né. Nós temos um tema que é bastante relevante, que vai ser apresentado hoje, um tema que deve chegar ao conhecimento de todos, né, para que as pessoas tenham o perfeito discernimento, né, do quão importante são os oceanos, né, para todos nós, né, de forma geral. Lamentavelmente, né, todos sabemos que no decorrer dessa palestra, né, ao chegar ao final dela, cerca de 10 mil espécies marinhas terão morrido por conta do lixo que chega ao mar, deliberadamente ao mar, né? Temos que ter a perfeita consciência de cuidar desse mar que é nosso, né? Apenas em termos estatísticos, para apresentar, 8 milhões de toneladas de plástico são lançados ao mar todos os anos, né? E esse peso, se a gente comparar, ele equivale a 57 mil baleias azuis, né? Só para a gente ter uma noção do quanto, de certa forma, prejudicamos o mar e temos que ter a perfeita noção do quanto dependemos desse mar. Dentro desse contexto do que vai ser apresentado hoje, né, pelo nosso palestrante, eu queria só destacar 3 cenários dentro desse contexto em que a Marinha ela tem um protagonismo, né, nas ações. O primeiro, né, como bem relembrado aí pelo nosso reitor, se refere ao necessário incremento da consciência situacional marítima, né, que todos temos que ter com relação ao mar. É importantíssimo fazer o conteúdo de hoje chegar a todas as pessoas, para que as pessoas tenham, como eu já mencionei, um discernimento, né, acerca do quanto dependemos do mar e do quanto o mar é importante para a vida de todos nós. E quando eu falo isso, eu falo em 4 vertentes, né? A vertente econômica, obviamente, né, de tudo que é explorado no mar, a vertente ambiental, a vertente científica, e para assegurar essas 3 vertentes, a vertente também de soberania. O segundo aspecto se refere às questões das responsabilidades que a autoridade marítima tem, né, na figura do comandante da Marinha, né, e de todas as OMs, organizações militares, que são subordinadas e que fazem parte desse contexto, né, de segurança do tráfego aquaviário, de combate à poluição marinha. Então, essas atribuições estão intimamente relacionadas a assegurar esse ambiente marinho que pertence também a todos nós. E, por fim, também, aí quando a gente vai para essa parte da inovação tecnológica, a necessidade de acompanhar diuturnamente todo evento, tudo que se refere ao mar. Né? Nós temos aí as questões de monitoramento, as questões de vigilância, dentre outras ações. E tudo isso vai impactar no final na nossa consciência operacional e também estratégica. Eu queria só conclamar a todos, né, que participem efetivamente, que assistam ao conteúdo importantíssimo que vai ser divulgado no dia de hoje, parabenizar todos aqui presentes por esse esforço coletivo, né, de empreender novas ações, novas ideias, né, que tudo isso vai culminar com um mar mais bem protegido, e no final quem ganha com isso somos nós mesmos e as futuras gerações. O objetivo principal, então, é unirmos esforços para reverter, nós acabamos de encerrar a década da biodiversidade, e agora temos a oportunidade de iniciar a década dos oceanos, voltado para a ciência, então é a nossa chance de reverter esse ciclo de declínio que nós temos observado. É um ano crucial para essa agenda ambiental mundial. É só agradecer à professora Zileia, a todos os demais presentes, e a Marinha está sempre à inteira disposição para cooperar e para empreender todos os esforços em defesa e em proveito do nosso oceano. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, comandante Marinho, por suas palavras, né? Sempre um grande parceiro, a Marinha do Brasil, da ciência e da tecnologia no Brasil. Muito obrigada. Eu passo a palavra agora para o secretário do Meio Ambiente do Estado do Ceará, o senhor Arthur Bruno.
Bom dia e boa tarde a todos e a todas. Eu quero saudar todas as mulheres que estão nos acompanhando nesse momento pelas redes sociais, em nome da professora Osiléia, e já adiantando aqui os parabéns à Universidade Federal do Ceará, aos que compõem o Labomar, por essa grande iniciativa. Quero saudar todos os homens aqui presentes, na presença do professor Moutinho, e em seu nome, saudar todos os que acompanham esse momento tão importante para os oceanos, não só do Brasil, mas do mundo. Para nós é um privilégio estar no estado do Ceará, onde temos um governador que é ambientalista, para sorte e privilégio do secretário de Meio Ambiente. Aqui no Ceará, o governador criou o programa Cientista-Chefe do Meio Ambiente e escolhemos um professor do Labomar, da Universidade Federal do Ceará, professor Marcelo Soares, que integrou uma grande equipe de pesquisadores, de professores de todas as nossas universidades para fazer um trabalho conjunto, integrado, com a Secretaria do Meio Ambiente e outros órgãos do governo e da sociedade. Isso para nós é muito importante, trazer o conhecimento, trazer a academia para elaborar políticas públicas na área do meio ambiente. Nós já estamos desenvolvendo com o cientista-chefe o planejamento costeiro e marinho do Ceará, que é uma referência hoje para outros estados do Nordeste. Vamos lançar aí no meio do ano, na última semana de julho, quando faremos o lançamento da década dos oceanos no Ceará. Vamos criar também um comitê estadual, lançaremos o Observatório Costeiro e Marinho. Também um dos produtos será o Atlas Marinho do Ceará, e que nós esperamos que outros estados possam também elaborar esses mesmos programas. E, portanto, nós acreditamos muito que essa década servirá não só de reflexão, mas de ação dos governos, da sociedade de uma maneira geral. E aí, quando eu falo governos, falo em nível municipal, em nível estadual e em nível federal. Aqui no Ceará nós temos uma tradição de parcerias, né, com essas instituições, e a nossa expectativa é que nós possamos deixar um legado para as próximas gerações de cuidado com os oceanos. Agora, no dia 18 de junho, nós vamos fazer um trabalho com prefeitos e secretários municipais de meio ambiente rumo ao Ceará sem lixão, porque nós sabemos que os resíduos sólidos, eles são tem maltratado bastante os nossos oceanos, a vida marinha, e a nossa expectativa é que também a médio prazo a gente possa cumprir a política nacional e a política estadual de resíduos sólidos. Portanto, parabéns aos organizadores deste evento, e a nossa expectativa é que a gente possa, com o conhecimento de vocês, aprender muito, não é, sobre como tratar os nossos oceanos. E aqui concluo com as palavras da sabedoria africana, que diz: se quiser chegar logo, ande só. Se quiser chegar longe, ande acompanhado. Nós queremos a companhia de vocês. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, secretário Arthur, por suas palavras. Agradecemos a todos que fizeram essa composição dessa rede, dessa mesa virtual, né, com todos esses gestores, o nosso gestor da UFC, o reitor Cândido Albuquerque, né, a representante do Ministério da Ciência e Tecnologia para a área oceânica, né, a senhora Karen Kopp. Agradecemos também ao comandante de Mar e Guerra, Ricardo Barilo, representando a Marinha do Brasil, e ao secretário estadual do Meio Ambiente no nosso estado do Ceará, o senhor Arthur Bruno, que todos juntos, né, formam uma grande parceria em prol do oceano. Agradecemos por essa mesa inicial de abertura, né, que iremos desfazer a mesa, mas iremos continuar aqui na presença, né, dos nossos palestrantes, e eu passo a palavra ao senhor Jerry Miller, né, que será o moderador da sessão científica, né. Tenho um grande prazer de estar aqui com o senhor Jerry Miller, que inclusive já esteve aqui na nossa UFC, participando de cursos de verão. Então, agradecer demais aqui a parceria com o Jerry Miller. Passo a palavra para o Jerry Miller conduzir a sessão técnica científica.
Good. Thank you very much, Ozalea. It's such a pleasure to see both you and the Chancellor again. I very much enjoyed the time that I spent in Fortaleza with the Labamar team and others from the university. That was 3 years ago, much too long now. I hope to be able to visit again sometime soon. I'm also very pleased to see the other speakers from whom we just heard. The engagement of the Navy is particularly interesting for me. My first research project in Brazil was in collaboration with the Brazilian Navy. And of course also the representation from the ministry and from the Secretary for the Environment of the state of Ceará. These are very important elements of a national picture for the UN decade for ocean science, and of course here on World Ocean Day. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker in just a few minutes, but I want to do that by showing just a brief PowerPoint presentation to motivate both the discussion afterwards, as well as to kind of set some overarching themes for our discussion. I want to talk in specific about our oceans and how it relates to sustaining human health, and from that, what we need from ocean science and technology. When I was last in Fortaleza, I talked about sustainability, the environmental pieces, of course, but also the economic and social dimensions and the interplay among those three. I talked about some challenges: the increase in human population, the increase in energy consumption per capita, and likewise with water. I also talked about the declining ocean fisheries, among many other issues that we currently face. And I also talked about what constitutes a sustainability crisis. How do we know when we have a serious problem? And I even asked some very dark and foreboding questions, such as, can we make our coastal cities resilient to climate change, or are they doomed? And of course, I did that in the context of talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG 14, which pertains to the ocean. Together, SDGs 13, 14, and 15 are the natural resource base. They are the foundation upon which all of our other aspirations and goals within the Sustainable Development Goals are built. That is, we cannot have these elements of production and consumption, that is, good jobs, supportive industries, clean water, things of that sort, if we don't pay attention to the ocean, the land, and of course to climate. And without those, we will not achieve the human well-being that we aspire to. So there is indeed a great need for ocean exploration, ocean science, ocean technology. And with that, I will now introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Alan Leonardi. Alan is president and CEO of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership here in Washington, D.C. That organization represents the leading ocean science research and technology organizations from academia, industry, and the larger nonprofit sector from around the entire United States. Prior to his current position, which he just started a few weeks ago, Alan spent 18 years at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, most recently as director of the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research. In that role, Alan oversaw and supported expeditionary exploration activities, which combined traditional at-sea exploration and science technologies, emerging advanced technologies such as autonomous maritime systems, and high-speed networks and infrastructure for live communications from undersea. Dr. Leonardi received his master's and doctorate degrees in physical oceanography from Florida State University and his undergraduate degree in meteorology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So with that, Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Ozalea, and of course, our esteemed speakers, the Chancellor, Dr. Silverwood-Cope, Commander Barrio, and of course, Secretary Bruno. Really appreciate everybody's comments and words. And Jerry, I think you've teed up very nicely what I'm going to talk about today as I start sharing my screen. Hopefully you can all see this presentation at this point in time, which appears to be taking its time loading, as is the nature of the virtual world we live in. I am going to talk a little bit today about ocean exploration, ocean science, ocean technology in the context of yesterday, today, and potentially tomorrow, in the hopes that we can tee up some of the rest of the conversation in the panel discussion and hopefully questions from our audience. I'm going to start talking a little bit about our current ocean needs trends. In the world, we know today that the air that we breathe is greater than 50% of that comes from the ocean. The ocean is a clear climate moderator. The economy produces tremendous amounts of input to the economy. We use it for recreational purposes, and the transportation of people and goods in and out of our countries is increasingly from seaborne trade. These are, of course, US-focused numbers, but these numbers are similar if you look at most other water-based economies around the world. It also is the largest food source on the planet in terms of protein, and increasingly has been looking at for medicines from the ocean to treat novel therapeutic and diseases. But we also know that from a climate perspective, things are not going well. They're not getting better. Marine transportation is increasing. Use of the ocean from a recreation purpose is increasing. Dependencies on the ocean for the economic purposes are increasing. The dependencies on food have increased by 226% since 1950. And we are seeing more and more medicines coming from the ocean. It is our modern day Amazon rainforest. But maybe perhaps the greater pressure is population. Since 1950, we've seen a 208% population increase This is through 2020 numbers, a roughly 3% per year increase. It's projected to increase another 30% by 2050. Only 1% per year, so that's a positive trend. But ultimately, when you add all of the extra people on the planet, each square meter of open ocean that would be potentially dedicated to our resources is about 40% less per person. At the bottom line is that pressures are going up. We are increasingly seeing trash and plastics in the ocean. Of course, we all know about sewage dumping and oil spills, which plague our seas. And these are things that are ever present, things that are increasing in some regard. And it tells a grim tale, in my opinion. And we haven't even begun to think about deep sea mining and the large impacts that may have, both from an economic gain perspective, but also potentially from an environmental impact perspective. The few studies that we have that focus on deep sea mining show that the effects are long-term. We're talking decades, if not centuries, in the making. So summarizing quickly on the trends perspective, what we know is that the ocean uses are growing, but economies are growing too. But as a result, pressures are growing. And as I like to say in a Hawaiian phrase, eola kakai, eola kaku, as the ocean thrives, so do we. We need to be considering these pressures and these trends as we progress. But what about trends in ocean technology? There have been many there as well. Let's think about the first pure science-driven expedition, the Challenger expedition of 1874. It was a 4-year expedition. It covered a huge amount of area at the time, had lots of deep sea soundings, dredges, trawls, water temperature observations, and there were 4,700 new species of marine life that were identified. Large crew, many of which survived, some of which did not, and it was funded by a philanthropic group, the Royal Society of London. Today, modern science is still expeditionary in nature. If you look at just one example, and there are many, this is an example from yet another philanthropic organization. You can see 6 years of continuous operations, up to 9 years by now. These are 2018 statistics. And in that period of time, they covered 350,000 square miles. They mapped 573,000 square kilometers of the seabed. There was 1,200 CTD casts. There was 324 remotely operated vehicle dives. These are new technologies, of course, that we didn't have in 1874. And 497 live stream videos from sea. 751 scientists participated from 165 institutions across the world. There were 30 countries represented in total in this period of time. And increasingly, students are more a part of the equation, with 261 students involved. This effort right here was funded entirely by the Schmidt Family Foundation through the Schmidt Ocean Institute. There are similar examples in other philanthropic entities around the world. And of course, our governments and our universities exponentially expand upon this as well. But the technologies have changed as well. We can think about the original diving bells when people went underwater into the deep for the first time, and the advent of the first remotely operated vehicles, to modern day operations that you see on the bottom right now, where increasingly large remotely operated vehicles are deployed from the aft decks of ships across the world, going to the depths, typically on the order of 2,500 to 7,000 meters deep, although increasingly we are seeing some full ocean depth capability, and showing us the mysteries that exist in those areas. Mysteries that we first just discovered in 1977, not too long ago. We are also seeing that sensors are becoming extremely more capable. They're definitely getting smaller in size, and they're most certainly more complex. If you look at the 1950s, when we started with sonars that were used to help us prove the theory of plate tectonics, then we migrate up to camera traps, satellites in the 1970s. We have landers that went into the ocean, increasingly better sonars in the 1990s. In the 2000s, we saw the massive advent of autonomous vehicles in the ocean. And of course, as we swing into the 2010s to the 2020s, we start to see next-gen sequencing. We start to see laboratories on a chip, on vehicles in the ocean, being deployed autonomously. And of course, there's an exponential improvement in computational power. If we look at the computational power of the early 1900s versus today, it is clear we have come a really long way. let's not forget that it was the first numerical weather forecast was produced in the early 1900s. It took 40 people working a 40-hour work week to produce a 1-hour forecast. Clearly not efficient. But with the advent of supercomputers in the 1950s, we all of a sudden could make 1-hour forecasts much quicker, and we have improved upon those forecasts today. The ocean modeling has ensued, and today we have more power in the phone that we carry in our palm than we have in our desktop computers from just the 1990s. Really talking about computational power, it's going to continue to grow. At some point, it might plateau, but it gives us opportunity when we look at understanding the ocean and using it wisely. Batteries are also increasingly getting more capable and longer lasting. The price point today is dramatically lower than what it was even 30 years ago. The energy density has climbed, although it is plateauing in some of the technologies. So we are seeing improvements in both of these, and they allow us to increasingly have more instruments deployed in the ocean, monitoring and measuring and studying things. And let's not forget how communications have changed along the way. We could go back 32,000 years to cave paintings and stone carvings. We can go to carrier pigeons or running a marathon to deliver a message. And of course, in the 1800s, with the advent of the telephone, and then in the early 1900s, television and radio broadcasting. And finally, in the 1960s and 70s, the advent of the internet. Today, communication systems are ubiquitous and instantaneous. You get a text message on your phone in nanoseconds from across the planet. These are things that we can use to our advantage, but there are also things that we have to grapple with in terms of understanding the ocean, measuring the ocean, and sharing that knowledge with society. When you put them all together, though, you really see a huge increase in the use of technology. If you look back to the early 1900s, we're still dropping lead lines to measure the bottom of the ocean. We're dragging nets to figure out what's in it. Increasingly, we're adding sonars, eventually remotely operated vehicles or multi-beam sonars, and then, of course, autonomous vehicles, satellites, ships, aerial vehicles, all at the same time to measure and monitor the ocean. The bottom line here is that technologies are faster, they're better, they're cheaper, they're smaller, and they're more ubiquitous than they've ever been. And importantly, they are changing at a rate that we could barely keep up with globally, especially in the ocean science community. So what about community trends for the ocean sciences? Well, ocean and atmospheric science is increasingly becoming multidisciplinary. Even just in the early 1900s, the number of articles that were multidisciplinary were smaller. Those numbers of articles are going up. What you see in this chart is the top line is multidisciplinary geoscience, multidisciplinary oceanography, ecology, meteorology, and physical geography. And all of them are becoming more multidisciplinary, especially the geosciences. Also, the ocean is, as we know, especially today as we celebrate World Oceans Day, is increasingly recognized as important to society. The SDG 14 target, along with 13 and 15, being at the base of that pyramid that allows benefit for society and human actualization, is really dependent upon truly our ocean. That is increasingly known today, and the UN decade is going to celebrate and improve upon that for many decades and centuries to come. But there's also polarization that has been increasing over time. Now, this is a look from a US perspective between our two prominent political parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And what you see is that in the last 40 to 50 years, there has become an increasing divide between how the different parties realize and look at environmental issues. The Democrats are more pro-liberal environmental issues. The Republicans are more conservation and maybe exploitation issues historically, and that divide is increasing. And that's not a good thing when we're thinking about wanting to make wise use of the ocean to conserve it, but also benefit from it. And then the last thing I might say in this regard is that the landscape of science and innovation funding is also dramatically shifting. Within just 50 years ago, the majority of the money for federal ocean science and innovation, or for ocean science and innovation, came from, at least in the US, federal government agencies. That has increased over time, which is a positive thing, but so have the increases over time in university sole funding for science and innovation, for corporate funding in science and innovation, and importantly, very recently, in philanthropic funding for science and innovation. These are trends that we need to take and pay attention to, and they're a signal that we are all in this together and that everybody wants to support ocean science and ocean innovation for the benefit of all of us. So, bottom line, from a community perspective, we know that the ocean community is increasingly multidisciplinary focused from a science perspective. We are more engaged today on ocean science issues, particularly with the UN Decade and World Oceans Day, but we are in many cases a lot more polarized than we were even 40 or 50 years ago. And the diversity of both funding and the activities being involved is increasing, which can be a strength. So let's think about the future a little bit and try to forecast the future. And I'll admit that my classic training is as an ocean modeler. So part of my job was to try to figure out how to create models to truly forecast what would happen in the ocean in the future, but also to use them as a diagnostic tool. And I will tell you from experience in the modeling world that forecasting the future is not easy. But let's think about how difficult it is for experts of the past to forecast future trends in their field. Of course, Lord Kelvin said that we would never have heavier than air flying machines. Charles Duell said that everything that could be invented had been invented by 1899. If you're into baseball, like me, you know that everybody thought Babe Ruth made a big mistake when he gave up pitching, but he became the greatest hitter on the planet. These are some of the examples that we have along the way. But even some of the modern ones are AT&T in the United States hires a company to forecast cell phone adoption by the year 2000. The answer that they gave them was 900,000 people would adopt cell phones by the year 2000. The actual number was 109 million. This expert company was wrong by a factor of 120 on the adoption of this new technology. As a result, the AT&T businesses were disrupted and they lost out on trillions of dollars in business. Similarly, in 2007, Steve Ballmer from Microsoft indicated that there was no chance that the iPhone would get any market share. In 2018 alone, iPhone users exceeded 100 million. And I don't know about you, there's a huge market share out there for iPhones globally. Okay, so these are experts in their field. This is how difficult it has been for them to forecast what might happen in the future. So I'm not going to pretend to potentially be able to forecast what we are going to be like in the future. But I'm going to close by talking a little bit about where I think we can make a difference. As I've said, the ocean uses, economies, pressures are growing. Technologies today are faster, better, cheaper, smaller, and more ubiquitous than they have ever been before. And the technology is increasing at an increasing rate every year. And the ocean community is increasingly multidisciplinary, engaged, but polarized, yet diverse. These all can be strong positive attributes for how we address our issues of the future, our issues of today. And some of the areas where I think we might be able to have the biggest impact today is addressing the pressures. We can make choices that can change the trajectory of the pressures on our planet and on our oceans. We can absolutely focus on technologies, making them even cheaper, even smaller, even more ubiquitous, and maybe even more environmentally friendly. And from an ocean community perspective, we should embrace the multidisciplinarity. We should embrace the fact that we are engaged on ocean issues today on World Ocean Day, and as well as part of the UN Decade on the Ocean. And we should increase that engagement, not just across our government and our scientific and our policy communities, but across the public. The public needs to be more engaged as well. And I think we can do work in that arena. And we should embrace the diversity of funders, the diversity of participants, and ensure that we are inclusive in our approach. We should be working hand in hand, country to country, across the globe to help each other on these issues that none of us can tackle individually. So I look back fondly from my first ever research cruise in oceanography, so many decades ago now, where I embarked on a cruise from Fortaleza and finished that cruise in Cape Town. And I'm excited to see the confluence of those connection points today, these decades later. It was my first experience with at-sea life, at-sea oceanography, and it was life-changing. I have continued to work in this arena today, and I look forward to continuing to advocate for solutions and for using sound science to make decisions and for bringing communities together for common purpose to our most pressing issues in the oceans today. I really thank you for your time. I thank you for your thoughts. I look forward to the comments from the panelists and any questions that the audience might have.
Alan, thank you so much for that stimulating presentation. I'm sure I can hear lots of virtual applause in the background. So very, very well done and much appreciated. Let me tell you that my Zoom connection seems to be a little bit unstable. So if I disappear momentarily, Jose Luis will step into the breach and keep the show going. But speaking of the show, we now move into the next segment of our agenda. This is going to be a roundtable discussion with Alan and three talented
it seems that we have lost Jerry. And we have lost José Moutinho as well.
Podemos seguir, então. Nós podemos convidar os próximos debatedores. E aí eu convido a doutora Meire Sakamoto para que inicie as suas observações, né, a respeito da belíssima apresentação feita agora pelo doutor Alan. Por favor, Meire.
Bom dia, boa tarde a todos. Professora Osileia, e a todos, muito obrigada pelo convite. É um prazer estar aqui. Meteorologista no meio de tantos oceanógrafos, né? Vou dar uma visão um pouco diferenciada. Vou compartilhar minha tela, mas apenas para ilustrar a minha fala. Após a fala do Dr. Alain Leonard, parece meio paradoxal iniciar com uma imagem retratando a seca. E, na verdade, como ele mesmo observou, os oceanos eles regulam o clima. E aqui no Nordeste, nós sabemos que os padrões oceânicos podem afetar o clima. E a questão da interação oceano-atmosfera acaba impactando a qualidade da nossa estação chuvosa. Eu falo especificamente do semiárido nordestino aqui no Brasil. Isso ocorre tanto por aquecimento das águas do Oceano Pacífico, chamado El Niño, também no Atlântico, padrão de dipolo, que acaba afetando diretamente o posicionamento da zona de convergência intertropical. Assim, a observação dos oceanos, como bem falou o Dr. Leonard, em sua brilhante palestra, não está voltada à primeira vista apenas aqueles diretamente afetados, como os pescadores e os demais exploradores oceânicos, pois, de fato, os oceanos impactam a vida de todos. Eu vou contar uma história também. O José Moutinho falava mais cedo, a Meire sempre tem alguma história para contar, e eu vou contar uma história que tem a ver com o projeto Pirata, já mencionado pela Karen mais cedo. E a história do monitoramento mais direto do Oceano Pacífico. E aconteceu aqui em Fortaleza, décadas atrás, na década de 90, que pesquisadores americanos, brasileiros e franceses principalmente, reunidos em Fortaleza, idealizaram o projeto Pirata. E o nome do projeto, não sei se todos sabem, ele nasceu de um acaso, do acaso do grupo estar em uma das mais famosas atrações turísticas de Fortaleza, que é o Bar Pirata. E
Aí, no Bar Pirata, um desses criativos pesquisadores resolveu utilizar o nome do bar como a sigla para o projeto que ali nascia. Essa história do monitoramento do Oceano Atlântico através das boias oceanográficas, que permitiram ajudar a identificar esses padrões que explicam as observações nas precipitações no Nordeste brasileiro. Esses conhecimentos, é claro, eles não pararam no tempo. As quantidades de boias aumentaram, as parcerias também, parcerias em todos os países. Aqui tem os nomes das instituições, das principais instituições brasileiras que fazem parte desse grupo que iniciou essa ideia. E esses conhecimentos todos vêm das parcerias, né? O doutor Alan mencionava a multidisciplinariedade, e sim, vem da parceria da nossa própria instituição, o FUNSEMI, com os pesquisadores das mais diversas especialidades, e aqui também a gente está incentivando a multidisciplinaridade, não só oceano, meteorologia, mas a parte social também muito importante, né? O homem é o mais importante desse meio ambiente que a gente vive. Esses desenvolvimentos, esses conhecimentos, esse entendimento da importância do oceano, das nossas questões climáticas, elas incentivaram, inclusive, têm incentivado, inclusive, apoios financeiros, tanto na questão de pesquisadores, mas também apoios financeiros para equipar, adicionar sensores extras a algumas das boias aí do Oceano Atlântico. E daí, sim, termos mais dados para pesquisas, ampliar o conhecimento acerca do oceano e assegurar melhores previsões climáticas para apoiar, subsidiar a tomada de decisão e beneficiar a sociedade de um modo geral. Aqui no Nordeste, dependendo das chuvas que ocorrem, e todos aguardam as previsões para a estação chuvosa, para saber se há condições de precipitações para recursos hídricos, precipitações para agricultura. Então, nada mais justo e razoável e objetivo do que apoiar esse conhecimento melhorado das condições oceânicas para que a previsão climática chegue da melhor forma e da forma mais precisa possível para o nosso agricultor, para o nosso sertanejo no Nordeste como um todo. Eu sei que eu estou focando nas questões aqui do Nordeste, mas, obviamente, o monitoramento do Atlântico afeta o Atlântico Norte, o Atlântico Sul, afeta a todos nós. E sobre o futuro, gostei bastante da observação do professor Alan, quando ele diz, né, o que a gente pode dizer do futuro. Talvez eu vou ousar e vou um pouco mais além. Eu penso que o futuro, concordo com ele, está também nas observações, na melhoria, na ampliação das observações, nos avanços tecnológicos, mas ouso dizer que vai além da própria tecnologia. Os benefícios aos ecossistemas oceânicos e à sociedade também devem vir do desenvolvimento sustentável, que ele mesmo mencionou. E vou terminar com uma frase atribuída a Jacques Cousteau, não sei se mas que vai servir para deixar como uma reflexão. Espero que o maior conhecimento do mar, que durante milênios deu sabedoria ao homem, volte a inspirar o pensamento e as ações de quem preserva o equilíbrio da natureza e permite a conservação da própria vida. Obrigada.
So thank you very much, Mary, and again, apologies for my having disappeared from the screen. Perhaps many of you know that there was a big international disruption of the internet this morning, and I think that those issues are probably continuing. Jose Luis was also similarly affected a few minutes ago. But now we will continue with the program. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sandy Tomala from the South African Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. Her main research focus is on understanding the biological carbon pump through measurements of primary production and interpreting these data in terms of their physical and biogeochemical control mechanisms. Her research has involved a number of national and international research programs, including in the Southern Ocean. So without further ado, Sandy, please proceed.
Sorry, I was on mute, and once it's screen shared, I couldn't find the button. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for having me, and a happy Global Oceans Day to everybody. So I'm going to be just giving a few slides to give a perspective from South Africa on how we look at science to societal impact within my group, which is the Southern Ocean Carbon and Climate Observatory. And just to take a few steps back, why the Southern Ocean? So the Southern Ocean is considered to be the climate flywheel of the planet. And I'll have to be honest with you, I had to look up what a flywheel does. And I Googled it, and I found out that a flywheel, essentially, the inertia of the flywheel opposes and moderates fluctuations and stores excess energy. And then it made a lot of sense as to why the Southern Ocean is referred to the climate flywheel, because it does just that. By absorbing 50% of the CO2 and 75% of the excess heat that's generated from that anthropogenic CO2 that's released into the atmosphere. And it also accounts for 30% of global ocean primary production. But the role of the Southern Ocean is expected to change with climate change, which impacts climate predictions, climate risk, the effectiveness of mitigation strategies, and the economic cost of adaptation plans. So it's really important that we get a handle on how this ocean is going to behave and change in the future. But currently, if we look, that figure on the left is looking at the subantarctic zone of the Atlantic Ocean, and all the different colors are the Earth system models projections of the seasonal cycle of CO2 flux. And the observations is what you can see in black. And it is very clear that there are massive differences between current models, estimates of the seasonal cycle compared to observations, both with regards to amplitude and the seasonal cycle. And this essentially provides a massive source of uncertainty, which hinders our ability to project and have confidence in our climate projections in the future. And a major source of this uncertainty essentially lies in spatial and temporal sampling biases, as well as weaknesses in model parameterizations and resolution. And this highlights the need for autonomous platforms, remotely sensed platforms, and modeling techniques, because these are all the techniques that are able to address the relevant time and space gaps that are generating those biases that are accounting for that uncertainty in our ability to characterize the system. And this is essentially where SOCO comes in. And we have a very multidisciplinary approach to addressing the role of the Southern Ocean in global climate. And we have a wide range of technologically advanced facilities that range from biooptics, where we're looking at remote sensing, algorithm development, robotics, wavegliders, buoyancy gliders, a lot of profiling instruments, a CO2 system where we're looking at CO2 flux and total alkalinity, and then trace metal sampling and analytics, specifically focusing on iron, which is a micronutrient required by phytoplankton photosynthesis. We have a biogeochemistry facility that images a photosynthetron that we developed in-house, and then we have advanced supercomputing. And essentially, we have developed a facility in South Africa to assist us with all our engineering and technological needs. And SOCO essentially pioneered the use of ocean robotics in South Africa. And in order to be successful at this, we also incubated a central robotics engineering facility, which would enable efficient and effective use of ocean gliders and all of our facilities in support of our research. The center is now known as SA Robotic, and essentially it grew from a partnership that we developed with a small SME called C Technology Services. And the key to the success of the center, indeed the success of our science, is by having this center in existence and by having really excellent engineers, which have been trained for, have received platform-specific training from the manufacturers of the various instruments, and then transferred that knowledge down through human capital development to students, interns, and technicians. Our platforms have also served not only our science needs, but also to innovate beyond the applications of our science towards R&D for capabilities with potential spin-offs in ocean services and sensor manufacture. And here is just 3 examples that I'm putting forward. The one on the left is an acoustic waveglider. So we took our waveglider, which essentially we use with a CO2 flux center, but what we did is we added an acoustic sensor, shock assessment, at a fraction of the cost of a research vessel, and showed the suitability of this platform for this application. We've also developed a high precision PCO2 sensor that we essentially needed to be incorporated into our waveglider. And we've now developed the most precise sensor globally, and it's gotten to the point where it can be manufactured and sold, and we've sold 2 units to Germany. And this sensor is also suitable for terrestrial applications. And then we have these wavegliders on the left that we have adapted to include a hydro generator. So in the Southern Ocean, one of the biggest biases we have is not being able to address the seasonal cycle because of bias in winter measurements. There are very few winter measurements. And this waveglider is what we use to make our winter CO2 flux measurements, but there's very little sunlight in the Southern Ocean in winter. And these instruments are driven by solar radiation. So increasing the size of the glider, we were able to add more solar panels to drive the instruments, but that still wasn't enough. And very importantly, we added a hydro generator at the bottom, which will allow the system to now be able to monitor the oceans through the whole seasonal cycle to start to close the gaps of our knowledge base, which is what's driving the biggest bias. And then just quickly to say that we also have a big focus on human capital development, and these technologically advanced infrastructure that we have provides a really unique and excellent HCD platform for training a new generation of scientists and engineers in these multidisciplinary skills, which is what we need, as Alan had alluded to earlier. And SOCO's made a very good impact on that. We have graduated 42 PhD and MSc students over the last 10 years. And we're also very committed to transformation, which is especially evident in our more recent history, where 85 to 100% of our students are from historically disadvantaged institutions. And our gender distribution is also well balanced with 56%. And so with that, I thank you. And I hope that with this perspective and this insight that I have from South Africa, I will be able to contribute to the discussions going forward.
Thank you so much, Sandy. The Southern Ocean is indeed an intriguing place and a key element of our global ocean, in fact, of our global climate system. Before we turn to our third discussant, I want to remind the audience to put your questions in the chat box. We will shortly be turning to the audience Q&A. So get your questions in, and we will address those in a few minutes. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our third and final discussant, João Tasso. He's a professor at the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at the University of Porto. He holds a PhD and Masters of Science in Electrical Engineering. His research interests include autonomous underwater, surface, and air vehicles, the planning and execution control for networked vehicle systems, optimization and control, cyber physical systems, and applications of networked vehicle systems to the ocean sciences, security, and defense. João is the head of the Underwater Systems and Technologies Laboratory in Porto. And João, I know you don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I offer you the opportunity to make some opening remarks.
Okay, so thanks very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Just out of curiosity, I also have more names. So typically in the US, I'm João Souza. So
Yes.
So, and actually, kind of a few interesting curiosities. So first of all, Happy Oceans Day. And this reminds me that 3 years ago, we were, at this precise day, we were on board the RV Falcor. So Alan, I really liked your presentation, very much in line with what we've been thinking and discussing. And so we had, on that day, we had a three-way kind of a call with 2 other ships, and we also had a VTC with the Prime Minister of Portugal, who was visiting the MIT at the time. So it's interesting because there's a common thread to what we did there. Keep in mind that I'm an engineer. Although on board the Falcor, I was called the chief scientist. So but this was very interesting because our cruise, and I'll talk a little bit about our cruise because it makes lots of sense. So was about the demonstration of novel kind of a way of observing the ocean with multiple assets. So we had over something like 10 AUVs, 3 ASVs and UAVs operating in coordination with the Falcor. So the op area was in the order of 50 nautical miles by 40 nautical miles, and we were operating there non-stop for over 2 weeks. And this was quite relevant because at the time we were also bridging this gap between science and technology. So as you know, in most places, let's say you have the scientists and you have the engineers, and then there's a gap there. And we felt that I was very happy with what we achieved there because we have scientists and engineers working together in our meetings. I'm pretty sure that somebody from the outside couldn't tell, hey, this guy is an engineer, this guy is a scientist. So I think there's also something else that you already alluded to, but I think it's worthwhile kind of revisiting that, which is this kind of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary work, because sometimes to make the proper use of technology, you really need to understand technology, but you also need to understand science. So, and basically what we were doing is extending the footprint of what a ship can do. The other thing that I think it's also relevant to the discussion here is that we were going from basically the mesoscale to the sub-mesoscale and going into, let's say, adaptive sampling with unprecedented temporal and spatial resolution that allows you basically to close to real time. Of course, it's not real time, but very close to real time, adapt your observation strategy to what you were seeing with multiple assets. Of course, we were using SATCOMs in addition to other means of communication, but that was really relevant to advance what we think is basically the state of the art in ocean observation for this type of, let's say, when you're interested in studying dynamic features of the ocean. Something else that I would also like to say, then again, now turning into new trends, just a few comments. Last week, I organized a side event during the All Atlantic meeting, which was about research infrastructures. So Sandy was there in excellent presentation. And the idea is the following. So right now, as probably you know, in Europe, we have a few projects funded by the European Commission about research infrastructures. One of them is Eurofleets, and I'm also coordinating another one, which is EU-Marine Robots, which is pretty much like Eurofleets, but for small or kind of for autonomous vehicles. And the thing has been going extremely well for several reasons. First of all, because we are funded to provide access for free to researchers from all over the world. So we had people from Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Uruguay, US, and Canada applying to use our infrastructures. Of course, this was through open calls. And by doing this, we were kind of basically expanding our footprint and building this community in marine robotics and science, which I think is also quite relevant, and we learned a lot along the way. So in this project, we had some of the key players in marine robotics in Europe. So we had the guys like the guys from Ifremer, NOC, Marine Institute, Marum, CMRE, the guys from NTNU in Norway. So this was a very interesting kind of a setup. And we've been discussing the idea of basically two ideas. The first one is how can we basically join forces with other research infrastructures to do stuff together that could not be done in isolation. So that's the first. The second observation, which is basically was also part of the reason why we convened this meeting last week, was to try to figure out, hey, if we can join forces and bring assets from different research infrastructures, then we can be more ambitious and go after sort of Atlantic-wide sort of challenges. And this should not only entail people from Europe, but I mean also from the US, Canada, Brazil, South Africa. So this was also part of discussions. So it makes lots of sense. The question is how to do it with minimal bureaucracy. Just two final comments about what I wanted to say. Another thing that we've been doing and has been quite successful in terms of, let's say, disseminating the use of robotics is we've been organizing since 2010 the REP exercise in cooperation with the Portuguese Navy, hence a very important reference to the Brazilian Navy. And more recently, this has also been aligned with the guys from CMRE NATO in Italy and the MUS initiative NATO. So the last edition took place in 2019. It was canceled in 2020. But just to give you a sense for the size of what we were up to, so this is an exercise. It's about operational evaluation of what we have been doing and developing. And 2 weeks at sea. So we had 9 ships, including 1 manned submarine, over 50 ASVs, UAVs, and UUVs, and over 800 people, 7 navies. This year, in September, we'll have 14 navies and many more ships. So ships from Portugal, from the UK, Holland, and other places. So I think that this is quite relevant, and keep in mind that this is not only about military operations. So typically we have academia, industry, and military. And I think this is an excellent setting to discuss and work together to promote, let's say, the advancement of these types of technologies. And finally, just kind of my final comment, which has to do with education. I think that we have not yet addressed, at least from the perspective of education, the gap between science and technology. So I think that we should come up with innovative ways of, basically, especially at university level, teaching our students to think differently, because I think that you really need to think differently if you really want to basically have an impact on future developments. So, and this is pretty much what I have to say. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, João, for that, and especially highlighting your final point on education. That's critical for our science and for the public going forward. Alan, let me turn back to you at this stage. We've heard from 3 brilliant discussants, each of which have a close nexus to what you presented to us in your keynote address. Do you have thoughts or comments inspired by what they have just told us?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jerry. And I appreciate the thoughts and the comments of Mary, Sandy, and João. There are a couple of things that come to mind immediately as I think about it. One is it's clear in all of the presentation and the discussion that there is a focus on emergent technology and bringing those technologies to bear to study ocean issues. Whether it's because the cost of oceanography is high and we want to augment what we're able to do at sea, or the operating locations, the Southern Ocean, can be extremely difficult at times. Putting robots in the paths of where humans might have been in the past is a smart move in the future. It's also clear that those technologies are improving steadily every day and in partnership between the academic and the industrial community. The example that Sandy provided where the latest PCO2 sensor, which is now the latest and greatest on the planet, that's an improvement in technology. But then they had to work with the Waveglider community to enhance the capability of that asset to be able to operate in the places that they needed to operate as well. That is a good partnership between the science community and the technology community that Zhao talked about. I also will comment that Mary really highlighted some of the additional pressures and stressors that we have and that we're facing from an ocean perspective. And they're not just ocean pressures and stressors. The ocean is not this isolated thing that's away from our shores and that doesn't affect people inland in our countries. It absolutely does through the climate system. It impacts things like drought and wildfires and things like that. And I think Mary highlighted some of that and highlighted some of the things that she's working on using both traditional and modern technologies to study some of the ways to better understand those so we can plan and respond more appropriately. And then the last comment that I'd make is really goes back to the education piece, which is I agree wholeheartedly that we need to bring the technological and the science sectors into the educational piece, but we need to start early with education. It's very easy, quite frankly, to get young children hooked on oceans. It's very difficult to keep them hooked on oceans all the way through the matriculation to university. And I think that that's an ingredient that has to happen day in and day out. In my former post with NOAA, we had educational lesson plans that we developed that teachers at the secondary school level could use in their classrooms. We revealed today, again, my former post, a partnership with the Ocean Exploration Trust, run by famed explorer Bob Ballard, and the Schmidt Ocean Institute, which Zhao talked about, where we are merging all of our lesson plans and our professional development activities into one place to make it easier for both formal and informal educators to get those materials. We have in the past translated some of those into other languages, and that could be something that we could expand upon to make sure that the reach is broader. But we also, I think, from an educational component, need to think it beyond technology and science, but also include the social sciences. Because at the end of the day, explaining the importance to the ocean to the public really requires looking at it from a public and a social lens. And I think that that's part of what the Sustainable Development Goals are really all about. And that's really the glue that is going to bring together our ocean science and technology communities with impact for the public.
Good, thank you. We are running a little bit behind schedule, and I do want to get to the audience Q&A. We have several questions already teed up and more coming in. I want to start with a question from Mohammed in Nigeria. He comments that the global trends are certainly uneven among countries, and then he asks, what role does indigenous knowledge and citizen science play in the future of ocean observation? So Alan, I would ask you to respond to that one. And when Alan is finished, I want to turn to Mary with that same question on citizen science, citizen engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two parts to that question. One is the citizen science piece and citizen engagement, and getting people to connect with the ocean environment, particularly on the coastal domain, where most people live. This is an urban ocean that we have in a planetary sense right now. Getting them to engage, getting them to take measurements, getting them to participate in World Sampling Day, which is taking measurements of genetic information along the coasts, and citizens are participating, makes a bigger connection to the ocean for the public, and potentially makes them want to better understand as well their impact and their influence on the ocean. But I can't underscore the second part of the question, which is the role of traditional knowledge and indigenous populations. We have to be mindful that the greatest stewards of the ocean historically and of the planet have been indigenous populations who have proven that we can live harmoniously with the ocean, with the planet, with the environment around us. We should harness that. We should engage the indigenous populations. They should absolutely be included in the conversation. They have knowledge to provide. They have a living and in often cases, an oral history of changes that we might not be observing through sensors. We should engage the populations, and in ways, I have to be very clear about this, in ways that are meaningful for them, not in ways that might be meaningful for us in the science community, and in ways that are culturally sensitive as well. So absolutely, I think from both of those aspects, we have to engage citizens, putting even the simplest sensors in their hands and getting them to a water base, whether it's an ocean, a river, a stream, or a lake, doesn't matter. Getting them to engage and to think about that water cycle is important, and engaging indigenous populations and tribal and historical knowledge, I think, is a key to us understanding both our past and how we might be able to sustainably proceed in the future.
Great. And Mary, I know from our short discussion just before the meeting started that you're often in contact with citizens from the general public, those without scientific background. Please respond to the same question with respect to indigenous knowledge and citizen science and citizen engagement.
Yes, thank you. Vou responder em português aqui. É verdade, nós aqui no estado do Ceará, nós convivemos e conversamos bastante com os nossos usuários. São agricultores e temos também indígenas também, mas temos o que nós chamamos de profetas da chuva. São pessoas que, pela percepção da natureza, realizam as previsões climáticas, as previsões do tempo. Alan mencionou a importância da participação dessas pessoas, dessa sociedade. E, sim, sem a participação deles, sem o engajamento deles, não há como gerar o conhecimento, a ciência, e que volte para o próprio ser humano. Isso não é um trabalho muito simples, já que nós, cientistas, tendemos a, talvez, muitas vezes, impor as nossas verdades, e essas verdades, elas precisam ser muito bem traduzidas. Acho que alguém no início falou da questão da comunicação, né? Primeiro como se comunicar. Jerry, nós temos aqui no Ceará, no interior do estado, se eu chegar numa reunião de previsão climática, eles vão me dizer: bom dia, Mary, como você está? E como está o El Niño? Nós temos El Niño, não temos El Niño, nós temos condições favoráveis para o posicionamento da zona de convergência intertropical. Onde está a zona de convergência intertropical agora? Isso vem de um trabalho de comunicação, de uma parceria. Nossos observadores pluviométricos são quase todos eles agricultores, pequenos agricultores, que são todos voluntários. Então, penso que também no oceano, sobre essas questões de monitoramento, as populações à beira dos oceanos poderiam ser convidadas a participar e compartilhar esse conhecimento que eles têm, para fazer esse trabalho de forma participativa. Quando você faz parte das medidas, os monitoramentos, fica bem mais fácil também de entender todas as implicações um pouco mais complexas que tenham. E, obviamente, do nosso lado, enquanto cientistas, trabalhar a comunicação e aí respeitar esse conhecimento cultural, né, que existe nessas comunidades. Nós viemos delas, no fim das contas, né?
Yes, indeed, indeed. So I'm going to go quickly to the next question. We have lots of questions coming in and only about 12 minutes remaining, so I fear that we won't get to all of them. I may try to combine a couple of the questions together, but the next one in the queue is, are there any positive trends or hope for an integrated coastal observation, forecasting, and early warning systems that can really be useful for local communities in small island developing countries or other emerging economies? Now, Alan, I know that you would probably want to say something about NOAA's Integrated Ocean Observing System, and maybe we'll get to that in a moment. But I want to hear from the technology side. So João, can you tell us a little bit about what's on the cusp for new capabilities to better measure and monitor the coastal ocean?
Well, this goes back, let's say, in our case, especially for Europe, this goes back to some of these research infrastructures that I was alluding to. One of them is called Jericho, which is exactly about that. I think there's still a long way to go, but at least there's will to do something about that. And then there's more to it, because the question is not only about, let's say, technology, it's about, for example, interoperability, which is an issue that is really kind of a showstopper for when it comes to basically systems integration or so. Another aspect has to do with the cost of maintenance. So, and the other one is the will to cooperate. So, for example, in Portugal, we have some efforts along those lines, especially conducted by the Portuguese Hydrographic Institute. But I feel that there's still a long way to go, because we have universities and research centers with some of these capabilities, but still we are not working in, let's say, in a sort of integrated fashion. And that has to do with some cultural, let's call it cultural issues that I think you probably you know what I mean, but also about, let's say, the issue of interoperability and how to integrate things. In this sense, I think it helps a lot to have some European projects that promote, let's say, provide incentives for integration and cooperation.
Good. And Sandy, let me turn to you now. You told us about some technological developments in your arena. I think you were talking mainly about the Southern Ocean, but what about application to the coastal ocean, and in particular in regions of emerging economies and small island developing states?
Hi, Jerry. Yeah, I guess, I mean, it's a really pertinent question and a difficult one to answer, because I think, as João has attested to, that is the direction that it's moving in. And certainly we are starting to get there with, for example, satellites being able to detect harmful algal blooms. And then, of course, the important step after that is to how to integrate all of that data that's coming from all those various systems into one place, and then how to disseminate all of that data to not just the scientists, but again, as it's been alluded to, the general public, who are the users of the coastline, for the fishermen, the aquaculture, just the people utilizing the oceans for recreational purposes. So it's a really massive undertaking. And I think part of the issue there is that there's a lot of money, I guess, that is required to not only put the instrumentation in place, but then to bring that data into a centralized place, to process that data, to get that data into a state that can be utilized to look and assess, and then give a really concise and clear message from all of that to the person who's interested in it. And that's quite a big thing, and it's definitely happening. but it's not happening everywhere, and it's not happening on the coastlines of countries that don't have the infrastructure to put in place to do that. But I guess that is, again, what's so important about these all-Atlantic type systems, where we are coming together as a global community to share in the infrastructure and the knowledge and the capability, and to try to make sure that everyone can start to benefit, and all coastlines can start to benefit, and countries without necessarily the in-house infrastructure and capability, and then using that as a transformative and educational platform to make sure that in future that is something that can be taken on and learned from and engaged with locally. So I hope I've answered your question, because it's a really difficult one. So I think we're getting there, and the trajectory is in our sights, but we are still a ways off from achieving it in a level that we would like to, or that would be practical and useful for everyone.
Yes, thank you, Sandy. I have just been notified that João has to depart in just a moment. So let me ask him, do you have any final brief thought for us before you have to go?
That's a difficult one, and I'll try to be succinct. 2 key words: integration and cooperation. I think that those are key to what we would like to achieve, and also goes back to what Sandy was just saying about this All-Atlantic initiative. Yeah, these are key to that. And I think that by working together, we can achieve a lot more than just by working, let's say, by ourselves. So,
good. Thank you, and thank you for joining us. I will continue the discussion now, and I'll turn to Alan.
Bye.
Now, Alan, you've heard comments on the last question posed, but perhaps we can pull up to a little bit higher altitude and think about coastal observing applications potential for effective developments in emerging economies and small island developing states.
Yeah, I think that there's a number of things here. For one, there are technologies evolving today that can actually allow us to monitor ocean environmental conditions in near real time for more than just, say, physical or chemical parameters. We can today take measurements of genetic information, DNA, that can be sampled very, very rapidly, which can then be translated into whether or not there might be toxins in the water that would affect anybody who might want to recreate, or the fishing communities, of course. We can routinely monitor the coasts today fairly remotely with very little human interaction by putting sensors out there. We can translate that information into numerical models that can then be used in both a predictive sense as well as a diagnostic sense. Predictive in the sense that you can use those models to understand what the prevailing current conditions might be, the temperature, the chemistry, or if there are, say, harmful algal blooms or things of that nature, where they might spread to. But you can also use it in a diagnostic sense. If something happens, you can then run a numerical model or a forecast product backwards to understand what got us to that condition if we didn't understand it to begin with. But those require in situ measurements. They require observations in place, both in the coastal domain and in the open ocean domain, because we know that the coasts are not purely influenced by water runoff or just the water that's immediately adjacent to the coast. But I think a key there is that the infrastructure has to be in place to make that a reality. And for many small islands or developing states, the infrastructure may not be there, and the resources may not be there to support that infrastructure. So in that regard, I think one of the key developments from a technological perspective is we have to make the technologies a lot less expensive. We have to make them easier to fix and repair, and we have to make them more available. I think without doing that, in some cases, we're not going to be able to have the measurements and the monitoring systems that are in place to truly understand what's happening in our coasts.
Good, thank you. In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask Ellen, Mary, and Sandy for any final comments that they might want to make. But between now and that point, I want to take one more question. And it's motivated by a question from Chloe in Ghana. She says, how do you think ocean coast and land-based observation can be linked together to give an integrated view of the Earth system? And I focus on this question. There are many, many more that are in the chat box, but I focus on this one because I think it will give us an opportunity to kind of get back to the human dimension of things. I talked in my short presentation about the need to have information from the natural world in order to support jobs, the economy, infrastructure, et cetera, which would then give us a chance to improve the lives of our fellow human beings around the world. And that really takes this kind of integrated global, not just ocean, but global approach. So Sandy, would you like to comment on how that sort of linkage or integration can or should be done from your perspective?
That's actually quite a tough question, but the short answer is that nothing is separate and everything is linked. And I think the best way that I can answer this question is with an example of some work that I've done in the Benguela. But essentially, what you have there is a stratocumulus cloud deck with a lot of albedo, and it has a really strong impact on global climate. And what's affecting that cloud deck is cloud condensation nuclei, which is coming from the burning of just high felt fire burns that happen seasonally. And you have the Sahara Desert with these huge dust inputs. And you have this enormous phytoplankton blooms, which are perhaps or perhaps not responding to the dust. And the phytoplankton are releasing DMS, which is a precursor for cloud condensation nuclei. So you have this incredibly interacted system of the terrestrial, the atmospheric, the aerosols, the oceans, the phytoplankton's role in producing the aerosols, and all of that connecting to cloud, to albedo, to climate, and to global climate, not just local climate. And so I know I haven't answered your question completely, but at the same time, it's just that you cannot ever address the question on an individual basis because everything is so linked. You have to the future is addressing everything in a connected way, because that's how the world works, really.
Great. Mary, very briefly, your thoughts on this.
Concordo plenamente com a Sandy, tudo está conectado e peço que todos lembrem sempre que os benefícios aqui do nosso oceano, ecossistema, eles devem vir desse pensamento de desenvolvimento sustentável. E o nosso conhecimento todo buscar a melhoria da vida da nossa sociedade. Ter sempre isso em mente e pensar no coletivo. Obviamente, quando a gente envolve o ser humano na questão social, fica tudo muito mais complicado. Mas, enfim, assim é que a gente deve trabalhar.
Yeah, indeed. Alan, a quick thought from you on this topic of the global connectivity among land, ocean, and atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key ingredient here for me is I go back to kind of the meteorological community who takes massive amounts of data, both land-based data, air-based data, satellite-based data, and they integrate that to produce products that people can use that might be synoptic in nature, or might be a forecast that it's a week or 10 days out, or even seasonal. And I think that's the key ingredient. The key ingredient is, regardless of where the data reside or who's collecting it, or the formats or the standards, is translating that data into products that people can use to improve the decisions that they make in their everyday lives. Whether that's the decision for me, whether I need to carry an umbrella today when I walk out the door, or it's a decision by a business owner to say, yes, I'm going out to go fishing today, or I'm not going fishing today, for example. I think that's the key ingredient. And getting to that key ingredient is understanding human, societal, industrial need and translating the data that we're collecting to meet that need.
Good. So now we have just a couple of minutes for our very final remarks before I hand the floor back to Azalea. Alan, you mentioned the Challenger expedition in your presentation. Perhaps most people, most ocean scientists even, are not aware that there are still biological samples collected by the Challenger expedition which have not yet been analyzed. It's almost 150 years later. So when we think about advanced technologies of the sort that Joao talked about, Sandy to some extent, new ways of measuring biological things in the ocean, I hope at least that we're not sitting here another 150 years from now with samples that have been collected but not yet analyzed. I would hope that technology would help us in that regard, because the biological systems, of course, are intimately connected to us as humans. So if you were to kind of step back from the picture a little bit, give us your final, very brief remarks on what you hope the future holds for ocean science, and highlight anything that you think we need to be doing now to avoid such issues a century from now. So Sandy, let's go back to you for your very final remark for that long-term vision.
Yes, so I guess, oh, goodness knows I've got samples sitting in a storeroom that haven't been analyzed, and I truly hope that the future is going to change. But I almost feel that that is definitely the direction it's going. You know, machine learning techniques, image recognition software. You know, you no longer have to look down a microscope and identify individual phytoplankton. This is starting to be done with a flow cytometry and a camera, and technology that looking at the photos and are able to identify the phytoplankton and then send out warnings for harmful algal blooms or typical toxicity. You know, it's going in that direction, and there is definitely a big push to become more automated, more real time, so that is not going to be the situation where you have, you know, the problem is if samples take huge people time to be able to analyze, and that's what you want to avoid. The people time should be in interpreting and utilizing the data, not in the analysis part. And I think that is the way that we are going. And, you know, we are starting to get to the point where we can put zoo scans on Argo floats, and BGC Argo is, you know, getting more and more biological sensors onto autonomous platforms and putting more and more autonomous platforms into the ocean to try to get the coverage and the resolution and the temporal and spatial coverage that we need to address the questions that we know are important. And I think—
Thank you, Sandy. I want to give Mary and certainly Alan a moment more to speak. So 30 seconds from Mary, and then a final word from Alan.
Okay, I speak so much about people and society, and don't forget I am a scientist. My area is satellite meteorology, but the work here made me to see all things in another view, and I please ask you, don't forget that our knowledge, our research is always seek to improve the life of our society. Thank you.
Indeed, that's a great note to end on. Alan, the final word is from you, and then we will turn it back to Azalea.
Sure, and I'll try to keep it brief, Jerry. Two main points. One, on the technological big picture, we are almost there today that we don't need to bring these samples back up to the deck of a ship or into a laboratory to run them. I believe we'll be there within 5 years. And we have to, if we are going to send instruments out to the to Europa and Enceladus to try to see if there's organic signs of life below what is a mile thick area of ice. But beyond that, I think one of the key ingredients for us over this next decade and beyond is having the support that we've seen through some of the EU Horizon 2020 funding to bring together communities of practice across nations and across disciplines. That support is absolutely necessary for the knowledge sharing, the cooperation, the collaboration, and the development of the next generation of projects, ideas, sensors, technologies that we see. We need to expand upon that more and more to include industry and philanthropy as much as we do government and academia. But I think that is a key ingredient to our success. These issues that we're trying to tackle, we cannot tackle alone. So we have to have that support that's in place to tackle them together.
Thank you so much, Alan. That's a great note to end on. Let me thank both you and our discussants, and of course, Azalea, for making all of this possible here today. And with apologies for running a couple of minutes long, Azalea, I give the floor back to you.
Obrigada, Jerry. Obrigada a todos pela excelente palestra, excelente participação dos debatedores. Agradeço aqui demais ao querido Jerry Miller pela brilhante condução. Agradeço ao Alan pela palestra instigadora. Agradeço a Sandy, a Meire, ao João pelas valiosas contribuições a esse tema. Muito importante a contribuição advinda de hoje dessa manhã de discussão, né, uma manhã que celebra o Dia Internacional dos Oceanos, né, o primeiro na década dos oceanos, e essa discussão, ela impulsiona, né, traz um impulsionamento das ciências do mar, visando esse desenvolvimento sustentável aqui tão bem colocado por cada um de vocês. E aqui reforçamos, inclusive, o slogan, né, da Unesco, a ciência que precisamos para o oceano que queremos, né? Então, a ciência e a tecnologia estão aliadas, né, para seguirmos, né, na construção, na continuação de um planeta saudável, construindo um futuro que imaginamos para os nossos oceanos, né? E identificamos aqui vários aspectos, desafios por vocês colocados, e que, inclusive, eles se entrelaçam, né? Compreender a interação do oceano e do clima, compreender essa conservação e uso sustentável da vida marinha e dos ecossistemas, a compreensão e a mitigação de riscos antropogênicos e naturais, e aí se inserindo a oceanografia social, inclusive colocada aqui diversas vezes, né? Então, acredito que atingimos o nosso objetivo com o dia de hoje, né, que é compreender um pouco como as tecnologias estão à disposição para que a gente possa entender melhor a dinâmica dos oceanos, o seu papel, né, tanto no passado, no presente, como no futuro, e também elucidar, né, alguns processos através dessas tecnologias que provocarão uma melhor saúde oceânica, para podermos contribuir para o desenvolvimento dessas abordagens inovadoras para observar e monitorar os oceanos. Então, agradeço demais essa relevante contribuição trazida por vocês aqui, a todo o público que estará nos assistindo agora e o que nos assistirá depois. Eu gostaria também de aproveitar a oportunidade de fazer uma pequena homenagem em memória ao pesquisador brasileiro que faleceu ontem vítima da Covid-19, o professor Fábio Azim, da Universidade Federal Rural de Pernambuco, que muito contribuiu para as ciências oceânicas no Brasil, em especial na área da oceanografia pesqueira. E, em nome dele, nos solidarizamos com todas as famílias vítimas da Covid-19. O professor Fábio Azim reportou, em nome um comentário, inclusive, da professora Flávia Lucena Fredu, também da Universidade Federal Rural de Pernambuco, que ele disse que ele fazia uma oficina de olhar para a vida. E nessa oficina de olhar para a vida, o professor Fábio Azinho sempre perguntava: você fez valer a pena? Você fez valer a pena a sua vida, né? Então, ele, com certeza, dito por sua própria ex-aluna, a professora Flávia Fredu, com toda certeza que sim, né? E aqui nós, todos hoje, nessa manhã, também podemos dizer que sim, que a nossa vida, sim, vale a pena. Hoje tivemos uma discussão tecnológica, que discutimos, além da tecnologia e da ciência, a vida no planeta, que é indissociável do oceano. Então, eu acredito que essas discussões, elas contribuíram para avançarmos muito. Aqui foi mostrado, desde a expedição Challenger, os atuais tecnologias que temos usados, né? E aqui eu faço uso, né, da inspiração que foi de muitos nós e que talvez seja de muitos dos nossos alunos também, a imaginação. E aqui eu trago Júlio Verne, né, com as 20 mil léguas submarinas, e concluo com a frase de Júlio Verne, né? Júlio Verne, que tinha o Nautilus, né, que observava os oceanos, né? Então, desde essa imaginação da ficção científica, hoje estamos vivendo outros momentos de realidade. Espero, e aqui concluo com uma frase, né, do Júlio Verne, que era um apaixonado pela ciência e pela tecnologia, né? Uma mensagem para os nossos jovens alunos, para os nossos jovens pesquisadores, né? Tudo o que o homem pode imaginar, outros homens poderão realizar. E então, lhes deixo aqui com essa reflexão, nossos jovens alunos, nossos jovens pesquisadores. Imaginem e realizem, né? Nós precisamos que vocês continuem com essa história que agora nós contribuímos um pouco. Passamos o bastão para vocês na década dos oceanos. Esperamos essa grande contribuição, essa união dos saberes. Desejo a todos, então, um bom dia, um grande abraço a todos e desejo a todos vocês uma excelente década dos oceanos e expressar o nosso contentamento de fazer parte deste momento tão significativo. Tenho o nosso muito obrigado, o nosso agradecimento.
Muito obrigado, Osileia.
Pleasure. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much. It's always difficult to say anything after Jerry and Osileia. So I'll just say thank you, everybody, for being present. Thank you, Alan, Sandy, Meire, João, and everybody else that is still there paying attention to all the speakers, and also to Tanya and Inês, because they really gave the full technical support that we need for this session to happen. So again, Osileia, thank you so much. No, always poetry around you. Thank you so much. Bye, bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, bye.